This is the screencast for Chapter 6, Section 4. We'll be looking at today's lecture, we'll be looking at demographic transition and also looking at ways to reduce population growth, including 2 case studies on China and India that are addressed in your textbook. And this is in addition to the case studies we've been doing throughout class. Okay, so the idea of a demographic transition is that when countries go through their normal process of growth and urbanization, they will eventually lower their population growth. And how this happens is first we have a decrease in death rate and then a decrease in birth rates. Now we're going to look at the graph and see that as that happens, we've got a place where we can accidentally get ourselves into a trap, which is what we have seen in Africa and countries that have booming populations right now. We can think of Africa and some Latin American countries as prime examples of this. But generally, like it says at the top, as a country develops, populations tend to grow more slowly. Again, there's a couple caveats to that, and we'll be looking at those and talking about them as we look at the model. There are 4 stages to demographic transition. I cannot stress enough to you guys how important demographic transition is on the AP exam. There are always questions about this. You might see it in matching with the stages. You might see them in free response, obviously, but there's generally at least 3 or 4 questions on the AP exam that have to do with just demographic transition models. So when I say that this is something incredibly important to remember from this chapter, I'm not kidding you. The first stage is pre-industrial, then we go to transitional, industrial, and post-industrial. And most people have no problem getting these correct except for not remembering where transitional goes. And so we'll talk about that as we go forward. But obviously pre-industrial has to be the start, post-industrial has to be the end. And so it's remembering that we transition into an industrial society. And so we'll look at that in the map, in the graphic coming up in a minute. And also, like I said before, there's this demographic trap that can happen, and when that does occur is during the transitional phase. So be paying attention for that term when it comes up. Okay, so this is going to be a graph of the demographic transition model. And what we have seen is that most countries tend to follow this exact same model, although the data is built around Europe, and more specifically it's built around England, and they had a very clear industrial revolution, which we can pinpoint very accurately, as opposed to countries like China that have more gradually undertaken it. But we do see the same trend, and you will be doing this graphing in an activity later on this week where you will get to see that for different countries. So to start off with, what we are looking at with a graph of demographic transition is birth rates and death rates, and that's going to be represented there by the red line and the blue line. And then the green line at the bottom of your screen represents the population growth. And so again, if you guys remember how we get the formula for growth, factoring out migration is just going to be the birth rate minus the death rate. So the new minus the out. So what we see here in this first stage, in the pre-industrial stage, is that the population growth is very low. You've got a high birth rate, but you also have a high death rate. A lot of that is just compensation for high infant mortality and the fact that life expectancy is not terribly long. You've got a good chance of dying, of some disease. You've got a good chance of dying because of whatever, I'll say occupation, but we wouldn't even think of it like that. This is hunting-gathering type of society, nomadic, and so times are very tough, so very high death rate. This is pre-industrial. So pre-industrial, what you need to remember, birth rate, death rate, both are high. But because of that, we have a low to almost no population growth, very, very small growth in our population. During the transitional stage, we see a lot going on with our 3 lines. First off, the important thing to remember is that the death rate is the first change to happen. And what's going to be occurring is that the death rate falls. The reason you can think about this as being like the agricultural revolution. So pre-industrial is like nomadic, transitional is like the agricultural revolution. So population grows rapidly. Again, the death rate has fallen dramatically, but people continue to have just as many children. And this is linked highly to cultural beliefs and to what has been the cultural norm. So if you lived on a farm and you needed a lot of kids, you're going to continue to have that many kids. It's going to take a while to catch up to the idea that not all my kids are going to die of a diarrheal disease before the age of 5. And so again, that birth rate stays high while the death rate falls sharply. Now, because of this, we can see the difference in those two lines. Remember that the growth rate is going to be that difference. So when we've got high birth rate and a fairly high death rate, we start to increase the population. But that birth rate stays high throughout most of the transitional stage, while the death rate drops almost exponentially. And so again, we start to see that population growth go and go and go. Now, eventually, the birth rate will start to decline as well, but we've already got a large population momentum built in. You've got lots of babies that will be then having babies of their own. So because of that large birth rate that we had, we've got this built-in increase in population. So you'll see there the growth rate is increasing, then it's very high, then the growth rate starts to level off. So we've got a decreasing growth rate, but it's still high. It's still it has still increased quite a bit. It's just starting to slow down from its very high rate. During stage 3, what we see is the birth rate fall towards the death rate. They're not going to be exactly the same, but they are falling. And this is what happens during the industrial stage. People are moving to the city. We have improved food production, improved healthcare, improved education. So the main difference that you'll see there is the education piece added in. And so we're moving towards the cities. Women have more education, women have more opportunities outside of the home, and so that population growth slows way down. This is the industrial stage. This is where we are right now as the United States. Now the stage 4 is post-industrial. And quite honestly, the United States would be getting towards this were it not for immigration. We do see this in a few European countries, but this is where population growth levels off because your birth rates and your death rates are matched up. So we see that down here, birth rates and death rates nearly equal. Now that stays like that for a little bit, but then what we'll see is the birth rate fall below the death rate. And this is when we get a shrinking population, or as they call it here, we get a negative growth rate. So that's the 4 stages of demographic transition. And like I said, all countries are going to go through this process. And it's very predictable, but at the same time, if we interfere with another country's culture, their norms, and their progress, we will see some drastic results. And that's what has happened in Latin American countries and Africa. And I'm not saying at all that it's a bad thing to go in and offer help when we can help. But what we have done by offering foreign aid, and again, I'm a believer that we should help countries out because we have the technology to do so. But what happens is these countries are not yet at a place to provide the education. They don't believe in that culturally. It's not a transition that they're ready to make. They are not industrialized countries. But we have provided them with increased food production. We've given them the crops for that. We've given them the know-how, the science, and all of that goes behind things like the Green Revolution. So we give them that. We give them improved health care. They're able to stand on the shoulders of what we've done and take that over. And so what we see is that in these countries, the death rate has dropped substantially, but there's no reason for the birth rate to drop. And that's the demographic trap that they get into. So in these countries where we still see very, very large birth rates, and we see large population growth or a rapid pyramid, if we want to go back to 6.3, what we know to be true is that we have given them the ability to decrease their death rate without giving them our cultural norms that would also decrease their birth rate. And that leads to an ever increasing population, which is very, very problematic. So moving on, how would we slow down this population growth? First thing you want to do is invest in family planning. And we've talked about that in some case studies and some bell ringers. But what family planning will do is provide contraceptives. And we talked about with case study, let me see, which one was it? Case study number 5, that this will reduce unwanted pregnancies, it will reduce abortions, and it will reduce female lives lost in the childbearing process. The other thing we need to do, and this one's very difficult, is to reduce poverty. Great idea, but exactly how do you go about doing that? And that's another issue entirely. So let's move on to what is perhaps the most important thing to do, and that is to elevate the social and economic status of women. Best way to do that? Educate them. With education comes the ability to work outside of the home, and with that economic empowerment comes social empowerment. And doing that is ultimately going to help women to make their own choices, which surprisingly are not to have 6 or 7 kids. Okay, so planning, family planning, it does work, and what we've seen through our case studies and what the book tells us is that we have seen a 55% drop in total fertility rates in the developing countries as a result of family planning, which again is providing methods for allowing people to choose the number and spacing of their children. But we do need an expansion to these programs. In most places, they do not include teenagers. We can think about that as being in our schools. Teenagers are not included. Schools are not allowed to mess with family planning. When you get to college, your colleges can, because you are considered to be adults. We also need to include sexually active unmarried women. That's true in our country as well as in other countries. And imagine this. If you increase men's roles in child rearing, they surprisingly realize how difficult it is and are not as eager to have a team of baseball players in their own household. So if men are responsible for more of the child rearing responsibilities, then they too decide to have fewer children. We do see that a lot in the United States, but in other countries, men are hands off. It is all the woman's job. So of course they're going to say, hey, we can have more kids. It's no big deal. But the women say, yeah, it's a big deal. And again, how do you empower women? The best way is through education. 64% of all illiterate adults are women, so you can see there a discrepancy. Women need paying jobs to be empowered. Worldwide, women account for 2/3 of hours worked, but receive only 10% of the world's income. They own only 2% of the world's land and account for 70% of the world's poor. So there is a huge discrepancy between what women have and what men have. We need to offer human rights without suppression. There are a lot of rights that we feel are extended to women, but because of the governments and the cultural beliefs, they aren't fully enacted. And so that's something I think that all cultures can really work towards. And the U.S. is not nearly as advanced as other cultures with regard to female empowerment. And there's a quote in your book that I really enjoy, and it says, "For poor women, the only holiday is when you are asleep." There's a picture in the book of these women from Burkina Faso returning with fuel wood. You can think about the amount of their day spent collecting that wood, collecting water, washing, cooking, and cooking with fire, not cooking with an oven or a microwave, preparing that meal from grinding grains. This is a lot of work to be done. And if you can tell, a lot of these women are wearing babies. It's a little bit difficult to tell, but this woman, especially here in the middle, you can see these little legs sticking out. So she's not just doing this on her own. She's got to carry her child on her back, and that's what she is doing. So again, the only rest for a poor woman is when she is sleeping. And I'm going to end this PowerPoint there and cover the case studies in a very, very short section 2.